Hi everyone, I'm Karl from Seldom Coffee Farmers Collective. Welcome to this episode of Coffee Economics with Karl. Today we're going to look at transparency data in the supply chains of regional or community lots, as opposed to single farm microlots. Ever since it started becoming popular to release transparency data about one supply chain, trying to make sure farmers were fairly compensated, I've found it a little bit strange and kind of incoherent, honestly, that this almost always focused exclusively on single farm microlots, as if transparency data and fair prices for farmers were only important for single farm lots. Transparency data for community lots and regional lots was always mysteriously absent. Even here at Seldom, where we have all this data at our fingertips because the coffees that are being sold to roasters are being sold by the organization that represents the farmers. So there's really nothing to hide, and there are no levels of intermediation that obscure this kind of data. When we started working community lots as a way to address a segment of the market outside single farm microlots, we didn't even release this data because no one else was. But the more I think about it, I don't see why there shouldn't be the same level of transparency data for regional or community lots, provided that roasters and consumers are willing to pay for the additional work it takes to keep track of and process this data. So I think one really important question needs to be asked and answered. Do you care about farm level transparency? The answer may not be yes for everyone, and that's fine, to each their own. If we do care about farm level transparency, then a real commitment is universal. It doesn't make sense that this is a priority for certain lots scoring above 86 and produced and delivered by single farmers, and less of a priority or less important for other lots scoring 84 and having been produced by a large group of producers. In order to make sense of this, I think we have to get back to why it is that we care about transparency in the first place. What are we really trying to accomplish by knowing these numbers? I can give you two reasons why I personally feel transparency in coffee supply chains is very important. And that's to ensure that our supply chains are free of abuse. Again, focusing on price transparency versus all other information that are out there, to ensure that farmers are earning what they need and what they deserve for the work they're doing. For anyone unfamiliar with the realities of growing communities for small-scale coffee producers, it's understandable that one might ask the question, why is this our business? Why is it any of our concern how someone further back in the supply chain is dealing with someone else that we're not transacting with either of them? And that's a fair question, and I suppose in a purely capitalist system, maybe this isn't any of our business, that everyone is, the free market's just working. And if someone's willing to sell for a price and another one's willing to buy for a price, then that's that. That's the free market doing its job. At whatever price that product can then be sold to us is the correct price that the free market is setting for it. However, in this case, the circumstances are very far from a situation of perfect competition, which is a prerequisite for the free market to set prices in a way that leads to a virtuous cycle and the efficient allocation of capital. Supposing we're dealing with smallholder coffee farmers in communities that experience some level of marginalization. Very often, we're dealing with vulnerable populations, low-resource individuals, and points of transaction in supply chains in which bargaining power is highly imbalanced. So this is why we value transparency information and why it's essential to ensure that we're contributing to supply chains that are economically and socially sustainable for all the individuals involved in them. As I mentioned, if this commitment is sincere and we really do care about ensuring fairness in all the supply chains in which we're participating, the insistence on this kind of data shouldn't be limited to only some coffees. In our case here at Seldom, regrettably, we've only been releasing this kind of information since the previous harvest. But as you can see here in the example that we're showing, we do have farm gate transparency and contextualization of those farmer prices. including all the farmers involved, all the farmers that contributed parchment coffee to these regional lots. So we can see here, we have a farm gate price. That's the weighted average that the producers contributing to this lot earned. You can see the average supply chain costs as well as the overhead we pay and what exactly we spend money on and where those costs come up. You can see in our annual transparency report where all of that's laid out. Scrolling down here, you can see the price that the farmer was paid and the average production cost. This is an estimation based on first-hand data interviewing the farmers that contribute to this lot. And again, this is an average number, so some might be a little bit higher, some a little bit lower, and these also do change every day depending on the conditions. So you can see that farmers contributing this lot earned a profit of 38 cents per pound, which based on average farm size and farm productivity implies a yearly family income or profit of almost $5,000 US. We can compare this here to the other side of the commodity market. Now this is the end of last year where prices were quite low. Farmers sold on average for the peso equivalent of 97 cents per pound, whereas the production cost was about 98. For each pound sold, they lost about 1 cent, leading to a yearly income of negative $130. Now here below, you can see each individual producer that forms the Passiflora traceable micro-regional group. You can see how many kilos of parchment each one contributed and the pounds of green coffee that was turned out. This lot was 150 bags, so all of these producers listed here contributed a little bit to those 150. So if you're buying 2 bags of a regional lot that might have made up of these, about 30 producers, or it might be a much larger lot made up of the harvest of many more farmers, even still, even though there's a very few bags, you can still have an idea of how that lot came together and how those farmers were compensated, whether or not you know how many grams from each farmer went into the bag that you purchased. So this is our take. This is the way we've decided to set this up and try to share this data in a more universal way, including regional lots. So when you all go to your importers and start requesting this kind of data, inevitably some excuses are going to come up. Surely very few are going to have it right off the bat, and that's understandable. You can't blame someone for not having something they didn't know you wanted, but this is the time to start taking steps in that direction. If you are committed to price transparency in the supply chain, try to make that a universal requirement. See who's willing to play ball. So one excuse that will inevitably come up is that keeping track of all this transparency data is just too expensive. And this is valid. All this data collection, wrangling, and processing does have a cost. But I think what's too expensive should be decided by the buyer. So for someone that's really committed to understanding these numbers and ensuring how their supply chain is working, there is going to be an added cost. But at least in our case, the experience that we have, it's reasonable. So I think the next question should be how much? How much extra per pound would I have to pay in order to make sure we have all these numbers and that they're all being kept track of from the farm gate up to the roaster's door? You might find it's not all that significant. In our case, if I had to put a number on it, it's definitely below 5 cents a pound, and these aren't even really big lots. Some of them are 30, 40 bags. Another excuse could be that it doesn't exist. And this could very well be true. It's not that it never existed, though. It's just that it was lost at some point, at some transaction point in the supply chain, probably between some rural intermediary and an exporter, or the exporter and the importer. There was not an interest in passing along this information. So then the question becomes, how do we get it back? How do we get it back for next season? I'm sure a lot of responses will be something along the lines of, it just doesn't work that way. That that guy in Colombia that told you that's how it works there, that's fine, but here in Peru, it just isn't like that. That might be the case. Things definitely don't work the same as they do here in a different producing country, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a way to get the same data. So the next question would be, how does it work then? And then the last excuse that's really more of a deflection that I've heard quite a few times is that you really just don't need to worry about it. That, oh, I know this exporter, I know this supplier, he's a good guy, I visited him. I know this guy wouldn't be up to anything shady. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. How do we know that their supplier is also a good person? How do you know that their supplier's supplier is also a good person? How do we know that all good people are always conducting business in a way that we personally agree with. Character judgment is not a substitute for data and verification. Without a doubt, the structure of the supply chain will have a lot to do with how easy or difficult or possible or impossible it will be to find farm-level transparency data for the components of regional or community lots. There are infinite configurations that could exist and surely do exist somewhere in the world, but we're going to look at just a few of the principal ones that I see often here in Colombia. So probably the most common configuration here is producer, intermediary, exporter, importer. This is often a difficult one because this point here between the producer and the intermediary, there's probably no quality control. They're probably setting a price based on basically how clean the parchment looks, how white the parchment looks, which is totally arbitrary to cup quality, but it's something that does happen. And most likely there's no quality premium of any kind. This is going to be at base commodity price, or possibly lower if it includes transportation. So if this is arriving to a roaster's door at a price that's significantly higher than the base commodity price, it isn't going to look great to have the purchase from farmers being right at base commodity price. The next point here is between the intermediary and the exporter. This is most likely where cup quality is discovered. Just culturally, at least here in Colombia, this exporter asks this intermediary, I want you to give me a printout of all the producers who contributed to this lot, how many kilos each one put in, and what you paid each one of them. This just doesn't happen. The response from the intermediary would be, none of your business. Who are you to ask me about my business and how I'm doing these kind of things? Because really there are few individuals out there in the world that really care about this, and there just doesn't exist a culture of keeping track and being forthcoming with this kind of information. And this is why over here, where the exporter sells to the importer, is usually where transparency ends, because we can get from the importer what they paid to the exporter, but then when the exporter goes to the network of intermediaries out in the small towns that they deal with, there's most likely no convincing these intermediaries to change what they've always done. That's not to say that there couldn't and shouldn't be. There are surely cases where regional intermediaries are paying quality premiums to producers. And there surely are cases where regional intermediaries are very forthcoming with this purchase data and providing farm gate prices to exporters. I haven't heard of any personally, but I'm sure they're out there, so I don't want to offend anyone who's doing a really good job preserving farm gate price transparency. Another configuration that we're going to see quite often here in Colombia starts with the producer, of course, goes to a co-op or association or some other kind of democratic farmer-owned entity. From there, it's going to an exporter and then to an importer. In this configuration, it may be considerably easier to access individual farm gate price data for producers that are contributing to regional lots. If the co-op or association has fair trade or organic certification, their record keeping is usually at a bit higher level because they've got to keep track of these things to maintain their certifications. So there may be very little, if any, added cost in getting per farm data to accompany these regional lots. However, this assumes that these regional lots are made up of coffees that are actually coming from the co-op or association members. This is quite often not the case. There are a lot of co-ops and associations out there who've done a really good job positioning their organizations and their products in markets, national and international. I mean, say they've got 100 members, they're producing 3 containers of coffee a year, and they get requests for 5. What are they going to do? Say, no, sorry, I can only give you 3. Well, maybe some would, but many would just find those other 2. So you could be sourcing from a co-op or an association who has a great track record of taking care of their members, who holds a lot of values that you agree with, but very possibly the coffee that you're buying from an importer that was purchased from an exporter, which was sourced from that association, is not actually from association members. It's from whatever random buying station that's out there. And in terms of accessing transparency data from the farm gate, it may be another story altogether. So that's an important question to ask when you're being offered association or co-op coffee. Another configuration we see pretty often starts at the producer again, of course. But then the next link in the supply chain is going to be another producer, likely a larger producer who has a bit better cash flow situation Maybe they're going to receive wet parchment from the smaller producer or more cash-strapped producer, dry it for them, and then we get into whatever supply chain that this producer has been dealing with. When this producer enters the supply chain, it may not be clear or apparent that some of the coffee is coming from a different producer. We don't know what went on at this transaction point in the supply chain. So in this kind of a system, it could be also really difficult to know what's what and get down to the numbers that we need. One more common supply chain configuration that I see here in Colombia a lot goes from the producer straight to an exporter who maintains storefronts in different towns throughout the country. And this should be the easiest to find farm level transparency data, because at this point here, it's the same company who's exporting is buying directly from the farmer. And in any of these configurations, anyone whose job it is to buy parchment coffee and then sell lots of green coffee is going to have a record of what they're purchasing for how much, just in order to know how to manage their cash flow and how much to charge for the products they're purchasing and processing. So of course, there are some businesses that are more organized than others in terms of bookkeeping, but at least personally, I refuse to believe that someone is out there just buying up mountains of coffee and has no idea who they bought it from, how much they bought, and for what price. The information is out there, it's just not being transmitted through the entire supply chain all the time. So if it's most likely the case that this information does exist, it's just not always being shared, why is it not being shared? Probably the most common reason is that supply chain actors don't know that it's valuable. They don't know that there's someone on the other side of the world that's interested in this kind of stuff. Of course, that's changing quickly now, and we need to inform our supply chains that this is important if in fact we find it important. Another very likely reason is that there was no quality premium paid to the producer. Again, at least in my own experience and what I witness out in the countryside in parchment coffee marketing channels, is that very, very few producers are receiving any kind of quality premium. Very few producers are selling their dry parchment coffee with an awareness or any sort of feedback as to what quality it has. Cup quality is almost always discovered at subsequent links in the supply chain after the farmer is already out of the picture. When that does happen, one option would be to say, hey, this is actually really good coffee. Who made this again? Oh, we don't know. Maybe we do know. Why don't we call up those producers and go ask them if they want some more money? It would be great if that were happening, but it's highly unlikely. And that has to do with the cost of quality control, the cost of running laboratories and processing samples when amounts of coffee are so small and premiums that are available in a lot of cases aren't going to make it worthwhile to process all the samples. So this one here in quite a lot of supply chains is going to be a big holdup and require a complete reconfiguration of the economics of these parchment to green coffee export supply chains. Another one I hear often is competitive reasons. So I don't want to share what I'm paying my suppliers because my competitors will go and pay them more. Well, if your competitors can pay them more and still sell for a price someone's willing to pay, then those producers probably should be selling for as much as they can, is how I see it at least. As roasters begin to insist on this kind of price transparency information in their supply chains, eventually we'll get to a point where not offering transparency data will be more of a competitive risk than offering it. So there you go. In summary, if you care about transparency data and what farmers are making, then there's no reason that shouldn't extend to regional coffees as well as single farm microlots. The information exists. All coffee is bought from farmers at some price, at some point in the supply chain, and somebody's writing down and keeping track of how much was paid for how much coffee. What may or may not exist is a demand and willingness to pay for that information to be processed. So if you're someone who does care about this information, it's important to express to your supply chain that you do care about it. So you want them to figure out how one could access this. And if it has an additional cost, what might that look like? And then decide whether that's worthwhile. Before I sign off here, you all know I represent Cedro Alto. We're a collective of small-scale coffee farmers in Colombia. In addition to making videos, my job is to find homes for all the coffees produced by our 160 members. We run our own export company here. We have spot coffees and more coming on the way pretty soon to North America, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. If you're interested in partnering with us to source coffees from one or more of the members of Cedro Alto, feel free to get in contact with me directly. My contact information is here in the video description. If you find this information useful and would like to be in the loop as more videos like this are coming out, please subscribe to our channel. And if this has brought up any additional questions, feel free to leave them in the comments here, and we'll try to get to them in other videos. Thank you.